Let's get to Tim Walz, who, just when you think no one's sitting at this table, neither she nor the big white blanket, can embarrass themselves any further, he does. She asks him, to her credit, about the carrying the weapons in war, which we know is a lie. He never served in war. He's been stealing valor for quite some time. And take a listen to this answer.
Say, hey, when there's a problem, you call a man. The Democrats can't even tell you what a man is.
So when you hear Walz brag about how much of a man he is, what does that tell you?
I think there might be a little bit of a cope there, you could say. There's a little bit, he has to remind us how masculine he is, trying to not even be able to load a shotgun or fix a truck.
You said that you carried weapons in war, but you have never deployed actually in a war zone. A campaign official said that you misspoke. Did you?
Well, first of all, I'm incredibly proud. I've done 24 years of wearing the uniform of this country. Equally proud of my service in a public school classroom, whether it's Congress or the governor. My record speaks for itself, but I think people are coming to get to know me. I speak like they do. I speak candidly. I wear my emotions on my sleeves, and I speak especially passionately about our children being shot in schools.
I'll tell you one thing. The most masculine thing that someone can do in America today is stand up for women that are not able to stand up for themselves.
Right.
So while Tim Walz is going on Gavin Newsom's podcast, attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy, well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I, every single day, am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men stand up for women when they're not able to stand up for themselves.
Tim Walz stood in front of cameras, proudly talking about how he carried weapons in war. A strong claim, except it wasn't true. He never deployed to a war zone, and this wasn't just a slip-up. It was part of a bigger pattern, a polished performance designed to impress voters. But when Megyn Kelly and Charlie Kirk heard it, they didn't just raise eyebrows, they came with receipts.
And the idea that you said that you were in war,
Yeah.
Did you misspeak as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar's not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog.
This is a sacred trust. In the spring of 2005, Walz walked away from that sacred trust, abandoning his post when he learned of an upcoming Iraq deployment. This is cynical Pubula saying this. He is a coward. According to this Twitter feed, he is a quitter. And every veteran I've talked to thinks that Walz is close to betraying the country by doing it.
They called it what many were thinking, stolen valor. Faking heroism to gain political clout? That's not just dishonest, it's disgusting. You see, Walz had built much of his political image on military service, wearing the uniform, using it as proof of his strength and patriotism. But when challenged, he backpedaled. He said it was a misunderstanding. Then he blamed grammar, then emotions, then school shootings. It was excuse after excuse. Meanwhile, real veterans were calling him out. They saw it not just as a lie, but a betrayal.
What Walz did is the moral equivalent of a mother dropping off her 5 preteen children at an orphanage in the dead of night so that she could run for Congress. Yes, it is that bad. This was more than just abandoning troops. It also reflects a major personal deficit in his character and makeup. By the way, this is written by a veteran.
One veteran even compared his actions to abandoning fellow soldiers to run for office. And that's just the beginning. By the way, before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and share more intriguing stories like this one. Now, let's continue.
And the idea that you said that you were in war,
Yeah.
Did you misspeak as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar's not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my...
Tim Walz wasn't just caught exaggerating his military past. This entire leadership style began to crack under pressure. He talks tough, claims to be just like the people, emotional, passionate, a real guy who speaks plainly. But Megyn Kelly and Charlie Kirk weren't buying it. They saw a man obsessed with image, not results. His speeches were full of dramatic pauses and heartfelt language, but when it came to actual leadership, it was all show, no substance.
Tim Walz then lied about it to run for Congress and acted as if he was on the front lines. And people in Walz's battalion died. People under his supervision died. If Master Sergeant retired Walz could not be trusted to fulfill his duties he had to his soldiers, his unit, and his nation in 2005, how can he be trusted to be vice president in 2025?
He made it a point to call himself masculine, as if that made up for the lack of action. But as Charlie Kirk pointed out, how masculine is a man who can't load a shotgun or fix a truck, yet pretends to be a warrior? While real men and women were out risking their lives, Walz was busy taking photos, giving soft interviews, and polishing his public persona like he was auditioning for a documentary. It wasn't leadership, it was theater. Megyn and Charlie ripped through that illusion. They exposed how Walz constantly shifted blame, never taking responsibility, always dodging the heat. When schools failed, it was the system. When protests turned into riots, it was miscommunication, and when he got caught lying, suddenly it was a grammar issue or a misunderstanding.
What kind of bullshit is that? No, you don't, sir. We don't lie about military service we didn't actually perform, like going to war. We don't steal valor by saying that we had a higher rank in the National Guard than we did. We don't run around saying we served in Operating Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan when we didn't. We don't stand and watch somebody say that we were in combat in Iraq when we weren't.
That wasn't just weak, it was insulting. And as we keep digging, you'll see this wasn't an isolated moment, it was a pattern, and things only got worse from here. Then came the pandemic. And this is where Tim Walz's mask really started to slip. At a time when strong, steady leadership was needed, Walz turned into what Megyn Kelly called a part-time epidemiologist with a full-time fear machine. His lockdown orders hit small businesses like a wrecking ball. Mom-and-pop shops were forced to shut their doors, some permanently. Meanwhile, massive corporations were magically deemed essential and kept operating like nothing happened. It wasn't about science, it was about optics.
Podcast attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy. Well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I every single day am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men.
And Walz made sure to be front and center for every staged moment. Press conferences, vaccine photo ops, emotional speeches played every angle for the cameras. Charlie Kirk didn't hold back either. He tore apart the numbers. Hospital capacity predictions were way off. Policies changed depending on which way the political wind was blowing. Schools stayed closed while bars and liquor stores were allowed to operate. It made no sense unless you saw it for what it really was. Panic management, not real leadership. And when people started asking questions?
All optics with no substance. Shiny headlines with no follow-through.
Yourself from that clarification. And then here's two pieces of this that are really... I speak like they do. People are coming to get to know me. I speak like they do. I speak candidly. I wear my emotions on my sleeves. And I speak especially passionately about, and then he goes on to blame it on the school shootings. I guess he was upset about school shootings, so he lied. But stop saying you speak like we do. I speak like regular people.
Walz disappeared. When consequences hit, when cities burned, kids fell behind in school, and communities begged for answers, he was nowhere. It was like he vanished the moment his leadership was actually needed. And while families struggled to survive, he kept smiling in press conferences, pretending it was all under control. But the truth was out, and Megyn and Charlie were just getting started. Charlie Kirk wasn't about to let the economic failures slide. He went straight for Walz's fiscal record, and what he uncovered was brutal. Minnesota was collecting mountains of tax money, tens of billions flowing into the state. But somehow, every time it came to fixing real problems, there was never enough. Roads crumbled. Schools sank. Hospitals struggled. Charlie called it reverse alchemy, turning gold into potholes. And he had a point. Despite record-high taxes, basic services were falling apart.
The fallout continues for Tim Walz on the disastrous performance he delivered, in particular when it comes to his self-described knuckle-headed behavior, which was just his latest in a series of lies. The reason he resorted to, I'm a knucklehead, was he got confronted with his latest lie that's been unearthed. There's a long list of them. This one was that he was in China when the Tiananmen Square disaster unfolded, when hundreds of people were killed. You know, whether you were in a place where hundreds of people are being massacred by their government.
Charlie mocked Walz's idea of prosperity creating more government jobs while punishing the private sector. Regulations were out of control. Small businesses got buried in red tape. Entrepreneurs, once the pride of Minnesota, were packing up and leaving. And Walz? He acted like this was progress. It wasn't just incompetence, it was hostility towards success. Charlie described it like watching a snowstorm hit a city, and instead of plowing the streets, Walz was busy throwing more snow on top and calling it job creation. And this wasn't an accident. It was a choice. A pattern of turning every economic issue into a government solution, then blaming the private sector when it didn't work. While businesses closed, Walz posed for photo ops. While unemployment rose, he praised his own policies, and the numbers didn't lie. Under his leadership, the economy didn't just stall, it suffocated. And next, we move into education, where the fallout got even uglier. You'd think a former teacher would know how to protect schools, but under Tim Walz, Minnesota's education system didn't just struggle, it collapsed.
Again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog.
This took chutzpah. Let's go through it. You said you carried weapons in war, but you've never deployed in a war zone. A campaign official of yours said you misspoke. Did you? Well, I'm proud, incredibly proud of my record. He keeps doing this. Equally proud of my service in the classroom. Did I mention I was a teacher and a coach, an assistant coach? Okay, whatever. But he's more stolen valor. In the classroom, I'm in the classroom. My record speaks for itself. It doesn't, actually. You've put a lot of lies into that record that you've been called out on by service personnel.
Megyn Kelly broke it down piece by piece. Reading scores? Dropped. Math scores? In free fall. The state saw one of the worst academic declines in its recent history. And what did Walz do? He doubled down on the same broken strategies. More virtual learning, more bureaucratic committees, more talk, but no real solutions. Parents were begging for answers. Teachers were burning out. Kids were falling behind, fast. And Walz, the so-called education governor, kept giving vague promises and holding polished roundtables. It was all for show.
Disgusting, repulsive, and reprehensible examples of abandoning one's unit, of turning back on country and instead for own personal comfort and safety that we have ever seen in politics. And it's far worse than I even think people are describing it. It is worse than stolen valor. It is abandoning your fellow soldier.
Charlie jumped in with hard facts. This wasn't a post-COVID blip. This was systemic. Walz's leadership had failed long before the pandemic. His obsession with staying politically safe meant he never took bold action, never stood up to the unions when it mattered, and never delivered anything beyond hollow slogans. Even worse, when parents pulled their kids out of public schools in frustration, Walz didn't ask why. He didn't change course. He just blamed outside forces, called it misinformation, and moved on like nothing happened. The result? A generation of students left behind and a governor who refused to own any of it. And if that sounds bad, wait until we get into what he did with culture and gender policies. When it came to culture wars and gender debates, Tim Walz tried to play both sides but ended up pleasing no one. Megyn Kelly didn't hold back. She laid into his constant fence-sitting, calling him the political version of lukewarm soup. Walz liked to pretend he was the adult in the room, the level-headed moderate. But behind that calm tone was someone who enabled radical agendas, then hid behind polished language and a soft Minnesota accent. One moment, he's on a podcast calling out political opponents. The next, he's silent while girls lose their privacy in locker rooms and women's sports get pushed aside. Meanwhile, he still tries to paint himself as the real man, standing up for women. But as Charlie Kirk pointed out, real men don't just talk, they act. And Walz wasn't acting. He was playing a part, carefully scripted, never too bold, never too clear. He gave speeches full of empathy but took no stand when it mattered. Instead of leadership, he gave compromise. Instead of clarity, he gave confusion. It wasn't courage, it was calculation. Charlie called it what it was, a puppet for party politics. When donors and activists said jump, Walz asked how high. And while Minnesotans dealt with the fallout-confused policies, rising tensions, and collapsing trust, Walz just kept smiling for the cameras. But the most damning part was still to come. Because when cities started burning and chaos took over the streets, what Walz didn't dow as unforgettable. Under Tim Walz, Minnesota's streets began to feel unsafe and the cracks showed fast. After the George Floyd protests turned into riots, police were overwhelmed and morale collapsed. Officers who once prided themselves on protecting communities felt betrayed, defunded, and demonized. Neighborhoods shook as crime climbed, and frightened residents wondered where their governor had gone. Megyn Kelly tore into his response. Walz waited too long to call in the National Guard, letting chaos spread until it was out of control. When he finally acted, he downplayed the damage, blaming miscommunication instead of owning the failure. That hesitation wasn't cautious, it was cowardice. People were left to fend for themselves, while Walz crafted talking points. Charlie Kirk wasn't gentle either. He brought out the numbers. Officer resignation rates skyrocketed, shootings increased, and insurance claims spiked. He exposed how Walz's soft-on-crime stance turned public safety into a political debate, not a priority. When citizens demanded action, Walz offered press conferences full of empathy, but no real plan. And while families patched up broken windows and boarded storefronts, Walz smiled for cameras, another photo op in a long line of stage-managed moments. The result was clear. Under his watch, law and order became a slogan, not a reality. The very people depending on their governor for protection felt abandoned by his excuses and empty promises. And then came the final blow: education, economy, safety, all crumbling under Walz's leadership. But it was the stolen valor and abandoned service that made everything else hit harder. Charlie Kirk dropped the hammer with one of the most brutal revelations. In 2005, Walz allegedly walked away from his military post after learning his unit might be deployed to Iraq. Veterans didn't call it a mistake, they called it betrayal. Soldiers under his command died. Yet Walz went on to run for Congress, wrapping himself in the flag and acting like a frontline warrior. One veteran described his actions as worse than stolen valor. It wasn't just faking heroism, it was leaving people behind. And instead of addressing it, Walz deflected. He talked about being a teacher, about being a coach. He smiled and repeated his favorite line, "My record speaks for itself." But Megyn Kelly wasn't buying it, and neither was Charlie. They made it clear his record was full of half-truths, rewrites, and carefully crafted narratives designed to win elections, not tell the truth. They tore into the polished political packaging. Every emotional moment, every "I speak like you" comment suddenly felt fake. Not just inauthentic, but cold and calculated. It wasn't about serving Minnesotans, it was about building a brand. And behind that brand, as they showed, was a man who talked big, acted small, and led from the shadows while pretending to stand tall. After ripping apart Walz's military narrative, Megyn and Charlie zeroed in on his media game, and it was just as manufactured. Walz didn't face tough questions unless the cameras were friendly and the script was pre-approved. Interviews were soft, reporters were hand-picked, press conferences were choreographed. Megyn pointed out that his version of transparency was letting journalists watch him read a statement written by 6 staffers he barely knew. It wasn't leadership, it was PR. Charlie compared it to a college group project. Walz would show up at the end, read the final paragraph, and expect an A. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, schools were falling apart, businesses were closing, and families were losing hope. But none of that made the press releases. Those were full of buzzwords and staged empathy. When teachers were burning out, Walz held a roundtable with political allies and called it progress. When crime spiked, he tweeted. When healthcare collapsed, he gave another speech. Always the face of concern, never the man with a plan. And Minnesotans noticed. They weren't getting answers, they were getting theater. Carefully timed, emotionally charged, and strategically vague. But Megyn and Charlie weren't interested in scripts. They were interested in truth. And the more they peeled back the layers, the more they revealed a governor hiding behind curtains of consultants and press teams while the state he claimed to love slowly unraveled. Now it was time to confront the failure that touched nearly every Minnesotan healthcare and immigration. And under Tim Walz, both turned into slow-burning disasters. Walz came into office promising reform. He talked about cutting red tape, improving access, fixing rural healthcare. But what actually happened? Wait times got longer. Hospitals in smaller towns were left scrambling for staff and resources. And the only thing growing wasn't great was the number of new committees, task forces, and talking points. Megyn Kelly said it best. This was the only healthcare plan in America that made people sicker just by watching it unfold. Doctors were frustrated. Patients were waiting weeks. And all Walz did was hold more meetings, nod solemnly, and act like the system was just going through a transition. But behind the buzzwords, people were suffering. There was no plan, just another stage-managed disaster. Then came immigration. Walz's stance was always vague, soft words, no real policies. Sanctuary city declarations, symbolic gestures, and open-door messaging that ignored the actual pressure being placed on local communities. Towns already struggling with housing, jobs, and services were now expected to absorb more with no help, no structure, and no plan. Charlie Kirk called out the disconnect. Politicians in St. Paul were making promises, while regular Minnesotans were left to deal with the consequences. It wasn't compassion, it was chaos wrapped in kind-sounding words, and once again, Walz smiled through it all. But this final act wasn't just mismanagement. It was something deeper, something dangerous. And Megyn made sure people didn't forget it. And this is where everything came full circle. Megyn Kelly ended the takedown by highlighting what she called the culture of complacency that Tim Walz had created. Under his leadership, mediocrity wasn't just tolerated, it became official policy. Failure wasn't failure anymore, it was transition. Disasters weren't addressed, they were reframed. And every screw-up was followed by a neat, emotionally worded press release that blamed the system instead of the people in charge. It wasn't just about politics, it was about trust, about showing up when it matters. And again, Walz didn't. Charlie Kirk agreed. This wasn't red versus blue, it was results versus excuses. Minnesota didn't get a leader. It got a manager in snow boots reading from a script. Optimism was replaced with spin. Action was replaced with delay. And leadership? It was buried under layers of shallow applause and staged empathy. They left no stone unturned. Military service lies, economic collapse, failing schools, rising crime, broken healthcare, culture wars, media manipulation, and cowardly silence during chaos. Together, Megyn and Charlie didn't just criticize, they exposed. What was left standing wasn't a strong governorate, was a man who talked tough, posed well, but governed like he was always waiting for someone else to make the first move. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments. See you on the next one.